Section 2. But let's look deeper. Now, if the danger from the communist conspiracy were all we had to worry about, it would be enough. But every thinking and informed man senses that even as cunning, as ruthless, and as determined as are the activists whom we call communists with a capital C, the conspiracy could never have reached its present extensiveness, and the gangsters at the head of it could never have reached their present power unless there were tremendous weaknesses in the whole body of our civilization. Weaknesses to make the advance of such a disease so rapid and its ravages so disastrous. And this feeling is easily confirmed by observation. But to analyze and understand these weaknesses, we have to go deeply into both the political history and the philosophical history of the human race. By your leave, or perhaps I should say without it, I am going to attempt that analysis, for we definitely need this understanding also as background to the suggestions of program and of action which will eventually follow. I shall keep this exploration from being dry and boring to the best of my ability, and I shall keep it as short as I well can. In my opinion, the first great basic weakness of the United States, and hence its susceptibility to the disease of collectivism, is simply the age of the Western European civilization. And I am not being cryptic, clever, nor facetious, as I hope soon to make clear. Some of you will already have recognized, in fact, that I am drawing a corollary to the conclusions usually connected with the name of Oswald Spengler. In actual fact, there were many other scholars who, during the first decades of this century, supplied what were probably sounder studies and interpretations of the cyclic theory of cultures than did Spengler. But the concept has become so associated with his name that we might as well accept that identification. So let me put Spengler's theory in simple language as concisely as I can. Oswald Spengler was a very learned but very conceited German who wrote a book, first published in 1918, I believe, of which the title in the English translation was The Decline of the West. A lot of its direct effectiveness was spoiled by the almost nauseating displays of erudition in which the book abounds. Chief Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes once called it, quote, a marvelous humbug of a book, unquote, which description actually reveals more about that eternal sophomore, Holmes, than it does about the ostentatious scholar, Spengler. And despite the way that Spengler overplayed his hand and overproved his point, a rather strange thing has happened. The so-called liberal scholars of the world completely demolished Spengler's arguments at once, and then they have kept right on, returning to the task and demolishing Spengler's thesis finally and for good every year or two for the past 40 years. For the convincing way in which Spengler's explanation fits the known facts of human history just would not let his conclusion be downed and forgotten, any more than the convincing way in which Darwin's general theory fitted the known facts of animal life would let Darwin's theory be suppressed and ignored 2 generations earlier. Until at last, the International Socialists, with the Fabians and Labour Party bosses in England taking the lead, made one grand and lasting effort to have Spengler discredited by being overshadowed. They took a meretricious hack named Arnold J. Toynbee, who just by the intrinsic evidence of his own pages is one of the worst charlatans that ever lived. They had Toynbee interpret and rewrite history in such fashion as specifically to supplant Spengler's cyclic theory of cultures with Toynbee's half-baked nonsense. And then they, the whole liberal establishment, especially of England and America, gave Toynbee such favorable publicity and such a terrific build-up as no other historian, not even the socialist H.G. Wells, has ever enjoyed before. The result has been that today at least 1,000 people are familiar with Toynbee's history and have even read a few pages of it, to each one who has read Spengler and knows what he tried to say. Those who are familiar with the way in which Stalin won out in his contest with Trotsky in the years 1924 to 1929 will recognize the similarity of the technique used. Stalin, who was in complete charge of all media of communication in Russia during those years, never actually suppressed nor even refused to allow to be published any pamphlets by or favorable to Trotsky. He merely held the press run and distribution of all such pamphlets down to a few thousand, on the ground that the demand didn't justify anymore, while pamphlets by himself or others condemning Trotsky were printed and distributed in huge quantities all over Russia. Incidentally, it is the same typically communist technique which was used by the Fund for the Republic when they printed and distributed 35,000 copies of Irving Griswold's straining pedantry in defense of the Fifth Amendment pleaders, and then printed and distributed 1,000 copies of Dickerman Williams's answer to Griswold's nonsense in order to show how fair-minded they were. But I'm getting off the track, which is that due to all of this huge buildup of Arnold Toynbee as a philosopher-historian, almost any American or Englishman who happened to take a notion, for some reason, to go digging into world history from a philosophical viewpoint, or just from sheer curiosity, would certainly turn to Toynbee, would never have heard of Spengler, and hence would have no chance to learn Spengler's ideas. And all of this introduction to those ideas has not been wasted, I hope, for it does emphasize this fact. Spengler's theory is absolutely fatal to the acceptance of socialism or any form of collectivism as a forward step or as a form of progress in man's sociological arrangements. For in Spengler's view, collectivism is a disease of society, concomitant with decay and remarkably similar to cancer in the individual. Basically, when you dig through the chaff and the dressing in Spengler enough to get at his thought, he held that a societal development which we ordinarily classify as a civilization is an organic culture, which goes through a life cycle just the same as any of the individual organisms which we see whole and with which we are more familiar. It has been many years since I have read Spengler, so I do not know how far I am wandering from his own specific or exact thinking in trying to present his central theme. There is certainly more Welch than there is Spengler in what follows. But the easiest way to make the theme clear is to illustrate the life of a civilization as a parallel to the life of an individual man. You then find that of the some 21 or 22 civilizations which we know enough about to discuss intelligently, some were struck down while in middle age and reasonable health by an enemy, as was the Neo-Babylonian civilization by Cyrus, for instance. Just the same as an individual man might be shot by an enemy or run over by a streetcar. Another, like the Carthaginian, never was able to attain its full normal growth and strength because of the overwhelming competition for sustenance and Lebensraum of a too close, too powerful, and too greedy a rival, namely Rome, which must have been the case for many a man in the barbarian settings of our evolution. And another, like the Assyrian, could almost be said to have died of a heart attack. It went to pieces so suddenly and so completely in the middle stage of an apparently successful and healthy existence. There were factors of weakness inside the body which caused it to drop almost exactly, like a man whose heart suddenly kicks up and then quits altogether 20 minutes later. The real point, however, is this: an individual human being may die of any number of causes, but if he escapes the fortuitous diseases, does not meet with any fatal accident, does not starve to death, does not have his heart give out, but lives in normal health to his 80 years and 10 and then keeps on living, if he escapes or survives everything else and keeps on doing so, he will eventually succumb to the degenerative disease of cancer, For death must come, and cancer is merely death coming by stages instead of all at once. And exactly the same thing seems to be true of those organic aggregations of human beings which we call cultures or civilizations. The individual cells in a human body die and are replaced by new ones constantly. Only when and where cancer attacks a part of the body are the dead ones not replaced by new cells which contribute their share of strength to the body as a whole. The individual human beings in an organic culture die and are replaced constantly by new ones. But even if the culture escapes enemy conquest and accidents of nature and starvation and all the fortuitous diseases, such as the internal bleeding which almost destroyed Europe at the time of the Reformation and the 30 Years' War, death will still come eventually, and usually a lingering death through the degenerative disease of collectivism. For collectivism destroys the value to the organism of the individual cells, that is, the individual human beings, without replacing them with new ones with new strength. The Roman Empire of the West, for instance, started dying from the cancer of collectivism from the time Diocletian imposed on it his New Deal. And while it was given the coup de grace by the barbarians 175 years later, it had already been so weakened by this cancer that the city of Rome itself had been an easy prey to Alaric more than 60 years before its final fall. Now, how really exact or how valid this parallel between the lives of human individuals and the lives of their well-integrated aggregations may be, I don't know. I certainly do not have either the knowledge or the inclination to support whatever belief Spengler may have had that there was actually a biological compulsion for a social organism to follow a life cycle similar to that of the individual. But no such rigid crystallization of the thought is at all necessary. For whether fatalistically determined by biological principles or not, there is an analogy between the two which is inescapable. And even if it is nothing more than a useful analogy, subject to all of the flaws and possible exceptions which may mar any analogy, it leads automatically to conclusions which are devastating to socialist theory. For it is perfectly evident, right in the cases of the very civilizations that we know most about, that both the Greek and the Roman civilizations did perish of the cancer of collectivism, and that the civilization of Western Europe is doing so today. Now, it is even possible to establish a fairly accurate time ratio for this analogy or parallel. It runs about 20 to 1. In other words, a civilization 1,400 years old would be at the physical stage in its life cycle, roughly, of a man of 70. And with that yardstick in mind, we can now come at last to take the look at Western Europe, which I've been trying to make worthwhile. And after that, the look at America, which is the real goal of all this preparation. The civilization of Western Europe arose out of the ashes of the Roman Empire of the West. If we try to establish any approximation to a birth date, the analogy becomes sloppy. For actually, the parallel is much closer to that of an oak tree which has been felled, but which still scatters acorns that sprout long afterwards. But if we still stick to the analogy of a man, nevertheless, we might consider that after a long gestation period, an entity which could eventually become Western European civilization was born in the time of Charlemagne. The boy had reached the strutting, stick-throwing stage at the time of the Crusades, the stage of growing intellectual curiosity in the Renaissance, the stage of youthful adventure in the ocean explorations of the 15th century. And then 3 centuries are the equivalent of 15 years for a man of the most solid accomplishments of a hard-working, hard-thinking middle age. None of these comparisons will quite hold water, and I don't know whether Spengler could have postulated some that would or not. But after all shortcomings of the allegory are recognized, the fact remains that Western Europe of the last half of the 19th century was remarkably similar to a man of some 65 years of age who had led an extremely busy life of great stresses and strains, but an extremely successful life nevertheless of mental growth, physical accomplishments, and material acquisitions. The old man had weathered every danger, had stood all the bludgeonings of fate, and had come out at that age with a tremendous accumulation of knowledge, experience, material possessions, and prestige among his neighbors, the other civilizations or societal organizations of the rest of the planet. In fact, in my amateurish opinion, the last half of the 19th century A.D., like the first half of the 6th century B.C. before it, was the high water mark up to its time of human civilization, accomplishment, and hope for the future. And it was Western Europe which made that last half of the 19th century the period of the highest level to which man has yet climbed in his struggle to reach an enlightened and humane life. But, as so often happens for the individual, by the time Western Europe had the knowledge, the wealth, and the ability to get the most out of life, it was ready to die. The truth is that, by a cycle which seems inevitable, whether it is a biological reality or only an analogy, Western Europe was worn out. And under those circumstances, the degenerative disease of collectivism, the cancer of social organizations, began its peripheral infiltration. Not only the early beginnings of the disease, but the certainty of its slowly increasing ravages and the eventual fatal effects of its ultimately advanced stages were clearly visible to the genius of Herbert Spencer as early as the middle of the century. And by the time Bismarck, forming that alliance of the autocratic top of society with the greedy masses at the bottom, which is so commonplace in history, began to crystallize the nebulous theories of the Marxists and other modern socialists into the welfare legislation of Germany of the 1880s, by that time the disease was starting to eat its way further into the body in disastrous fashion. Its ravages continued, increased, and spread until today Western Europe is so sick and weakened from the collectivism in its body and veins that it can never recover. This doesn't mean that in the normal course of events Europe will soon become a desolate waste, while the monuments of its former kings lie toppled and forgotten where the lone and level sands stretch far away. Even when an individual is dying of cancer, there are periods of apparent recovery or improvement, and even times when some organs of the body seem as strong, healthy, and invulnerable to the disease as ever. Also, I must emphasize again that there are many points, such as the doubtful transmissibility of cancer itself to individuals through either contagion or environment, at which there are apparently flaws in the analogy which would take more time than we can spare here to put in their proper light. And, sticking to the historical parallels for the minute, rather than the biological one, it is clear that even hundreds of years after the fall of the Assyrian, Neo-Babylonian, and Persian civilizations in the Tigris-Euphrates stretches of Western Asia, the subjects of the Sassanid dynasty and other lesser offsprings of those once great civilizations led lives that were perhaps happy and that certainly were important to themselves. I am sure that likewise it will be a long time before the lizards run undisturbed over the toppled ruins of the Arc de Triomphe, or London Bridge is allowed to fall unreconstructed into the waters of the Thames. But our analysis does mean that the entity which was Western Europe, the social organism which was so closely knit and so well integrated despite its national boundaries, languages, and jealousies, the Western Europe whose parts were so intertwined that Napoleon of France could marry the daughter of the Emperor of Austria to help one of his brothers to rule Spain and another brother to rule Holland, the Western Europe which could spare the strength to spread its pioneers to colonize the uninhabited lands, and its Pukka Sahibs to bring civilized rule to the settled natives on all the continents of earth. That Western Europe of the 19th century can never come back. It is either dying before our eyes or is already dead, for the vigor of its muscles and the strength of its whole body have been sapped beyond recovery by the cancer of collectivism. Now, lest I seem to be putting too much dependence in an analogy which is full of holes, let me just very briefly make a more matter-of-fact approach towards the same conclusion. For regardless of any organic cycle which may be involved, it is perfectly visible and incontrovertible that the rugged pioneer settlers of a new land want as little government as possible. That as the new society becomes more settled, as population grows, as commerce and our industry increase, as the society grows older, more and more government creeps in. And then, because demagogues find it to their personal advantage, they use trickery, persuasion, and bribery of the people with their own money to make the rate of increase in the quantity and reach of government far greater than the rate of increase in either the population or the justifiable need for government. So that by the time any society which has been so originated and fashioned has reached a thick population, comparative wealth, and considerable age, enough government has already been imposed on the people to constitute the beginnings of collectivism. This happened to the people who settled the islands and founded the city-states of Greece. It happened to their descendants who settled the Italian peninsula and founded the Roman Empire. It happened to their spiritual descendants who built the Western European civilization. And it is certainly happening to their descendants who founded and have built the American Republic. With the next inevitable stage, after advanced collectivism has destroyed the vigor of any such society, which is its breakup into feudal units and the accompanying serfdom, we are not concerned here. But what we are concerned with is the time usually involved in these successive developments. It is this question of the speed of the movement around the arc, from pioneer to serf, or of the various stages of the movement to which this whole present discussion has been leading. And purely for the sake of simplicity and clarity, I hope you will let me go back to my analogy, even if you now regard it only as a figure of speech. For the whole point is that the Greek civilization was at least many centuries old, that is, many centuries removed from its pioneer days, before Pericles started it on the road to death at the very height of its glory, through making the government increasingly responsible for its citizens, instead of its citizens being responsible for and watchdogs over their government. Rome was already over 1,000 years from the days of Romulus and Remus, when Diocletian's reign signalized the advance of collectivism beyond the point of any possible recovery. Western Europe was, by a most conservative method of figuring its age, at least 11 to 1,200 years old before the disease of collectivism began to bring it to its deathbed. Or we even know enough today to go back in the other direction, where we find that the first Babylonian civilization also was at least 1,000 years old before collectivism had become sufficiently prevalent for Hammurabi to formalize it as the New Deal of his era. Now, in view of all of that, take a look at what has happened to America. It's true that the same thing has also happened to most of the other former British colonies, such as Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. But that's not our concern here. And there was a little more justification for it anyway, because they remained more closely tied to England. But the United States was not only a new and completely independent country, it was, by any measure of appraisal, the seat of a whole new civilization. There are few parallels in history more striking than the way Italy was settled by Greek pioneers who simply took over from the aborigines already there and developed the new nation and new civilization of Rome, and the way America was settled by pioneers from Western Europe who developed a new nation and a new civilization here. In its earliest centuries, America not only did not regard itself as a part of the European organism at all, but became fiercely proud of its differences from Europe and of its indigenously vigorous customs, culture, and destiny of its own. The American civilization was every bit as much of an entirely new and different civilization from the old and ancestral one of Western Europe as was Rome, a new civilization distinct from Greece. And this American civilization at the turn of the present century was only 300 years old. It had the strength and vigor and promise of a healthy young man in his late teens. There was no reason on earth for any such organism to be attacked by and start succumbing to the cancerous disease of collectivism at that stage of its young manhood, with its whole lifespan of accomplishment before it. And any of the natural or fortuitous attempts of the disease to get a foothold in the American social body, such as the virus implanted by Edward Bellamy with his Looking Backward, or by Upton Sinclair with his Jungle, or even the more pretentious concoctions of Thorstein Veblen, would have been so easily repulsed by the strong and growing organism that none of them would have left even a scar. But we have the cancerous disease of collectivism firmly implanted now, nevertheless. We have people feeling that nothing should be done by them, but everything for them, by the government. Its disastrous ravages are quite far advanced, and we have it basically because of too long and too close an association with a parent that was dying of the disease, that was old enough and weakened enough for the virus to be rampantly active throughout this parent's whole environment. When Woodrow Wilson, cajoled and guided even then by the collectivists of Europe, took us into the First World War, while solemnly swearing that he would never do so, he did much more than end America's great period of happy and wholesome independence of Europe. He put his healthy young country in the same house, and for a while in the same bed, with this parent who was already yielding to the collectivist cancer. We never got out of that house again. We were once more put back even in the same bed by Franklin D. Roosevelt, also while lying in his teeth about his intentions, and we've never been able to get out of that bed since. In the meantime, the closer our relationship with this parent civilization has become, and the more exposed to the unhealthy air and the raging virus of the sick room we have been, the sicker and more morbidly diseased has the patient become. Until now, there is a tremendous question whether, even if we did not have the communist conspirators deliberately helping to spread the virus for their own purposes, we could recover from just the natural demagogue-fed spread of that virus when it is already so far advanced. With the communists skillfully using and encouraging the disease as a means of weakening us, the outlook leads ever more irresistibly to despondency and despair, and we simply cannot overlook or underrate the prevalence of this disease in our vitals, entirely aside from the way the communists agitate the affected part and make the disease worse, in any sound thinking or constructive plans for the future of America. But if I thought all hope were gone, I wouldn't be here, and neither would you. Let's leave the communist disease carriers out of the picture for a minute. I knew a man who, when he was around 50 and still otherwise a very healthy 50, was found by the doctors to have cancer already far advanced in one side of his jaw. They took that side of his jaw and practically half his face right away from him at once. And when I first got to know him, at least 10 years later, he had a very peculiar-looking face, it is true. But otherwise, he was a grand example of both mental and physical health for a man of 65, and he was very happily teaching his lifetime subject as a professor at one of our most famous universities. Practically all of you have known somewhat similar cases, and it is certain that in those very rare cases where a healthy young man of 25 does, in some way, contract cancer, a sufficiently accurate diagnosis and sufficiently drastic surgery can restore him to health and enable him to go on and live out a normal, active, successful, and happy life. But it can't be done by half measures. Now, what I have been trying so long and so hard to say comes to this. We've got to stop the communists for many reasons. One reason is to keep them from agitating our cancerous tissues, reimplanting the virus and working to spread it so that we never have any chance of recovery. And stopping the communists is the most urgently important task before us, which we're going to talk about plenty at this meeting. But even in stopping them, or in our efforts to do so, we cannot forget for a minute the disease which has enabled them to go so far, weaken us so much, and become so dangerous to us. Nor can we forget for a minute the imperative need of excising and stopping the disease itself while we are stopping and after we have stopped the communists, or we shall merely die a somewhat slower and more lingering national death, than if we let the communists destroy us in the first place. Push the communists back. Get out of the bed of a Europe that is dying with this cancer of collectivism, and breathe our own healthy air of opportunity, enterprise, and freedom. Then the cancer we already have, even though it is of considerable growth, can be cut out. And despite the bad scars and the loss of some muscles, this young, strong, great new nation, restored to vigor, courage, ambition, and self-confidence, can still go ahead to fulfill its great destiny and to become an even more glorious example for all the earth than it ever was before. It should be centuries from now before the natural time comes for the decline of America and for the highest torch of civilization to be taken over by the rising newer nations to the west. But we do have to achieve this we have inherited, spiritual as well as material, and at the cause of that danger, we come to the second of the fundamental reasons for deep and basic anxiety. And putting that matter bluntly, at once, the reason is simply loss of faith. Not just loss of faith in God and all his works, but loss of faith in man and his works too, in his reasons for existence, in his purposes, and in his hopes. Now I know that there are still millions of devout Catholics, fundamentalist Protestants, and faithful Jews in this country who still believe unquestioningly in the divine truths and powers which their Bibles reveal to them, and whose conduct and relations with their fellow men are guided strictly by the precepts of their religious faith, or who at least feel that they have sinned whenever they have transgressed such precepts as understood by their consciences. I have hundreds of good friends in those categories, including some in this room. Let all of us thank whatever God we severally worship that there is so large a remnant of the really true believers still left. We honor them. We need their steadying adherence to the rock of reverence and their aspiration of unwavering obedience to ancient and divine commandments. We desperately need their unshakable confidence in absolutes, in eternal principles and truths, in a world of increasing relativity and transitoriness in all things. We admire them. In fact, as will become more clear tomorrow, the young man I admire most of all of those America has produced was a fundamentalist Baptist missionary named John Birch. My own obsession with this fight against the increasing forces of evil in the world, which, as already explained, has caused me to give up business career and income and any prospect of ever having any peace or leisure again during my lifetime, is due in large part to my admiration for John Birch, to my feeling that I simply had to pick up and carry, to the utmost of my ability and energy, the torch of a human righteousness which he was carrying so well and so faithfully when the communists struck him down. The true fundamentalists in our midst, whether Catholics, Protestants, or Jews, are the moral salt of the earth, of an increasingly savorless earth, where such salt is like a stream of clear water in a desert. And nothing I say now, nor any of the plans I outline tomorrow, is intended to question, weaken, or disturb any fundamentalist faith in the slightest, or to discount one iota its tremendous worth as a core of strength for all that we might hope to do. But we must not let our admiration for, dependence on, and feeling of spiritual kinship with the fundamentalists blind us to the visible fact that their number grows smaller every year. Among the people literate enough and ambitious enough to be activists in Europe and America, that is, among the leaders of all levels and in all segments of society, from a factory foreman to the chairman of a political party, whose total influence determines what gets done, what the masses think, and which way community, state, or nation moves on the ideological parade ground. Among this 10% or 30% of the population, or whatever the percentage may be, those who are honestly true believers in a faith which most of them still profess is an ever smaller minority. It becomes increasingly smaller with every senior class our colleges now turn out, with every novel of the Peyton Place or by love-possessed type which the hundreds of thousands read, and with the impact of many of the television programs which millions of viewers see. What is far worse, fully one-third of the services in at least the Protestant churches of America are helping that trend, for the ministers themselves are not true believers in the divine names or the divine history and divine teachings to which they give lip service as they go through their conventional motions on Sunday mornings. Some have merely watered down the faith of our fathers and of theirs into an innocuous philosophy instead of an evangelistic religion. Some have converted Christianity into a so-called, quote, social gospel, unquote, that bypasses all questions of dogma with an indifference which is comfortable to both themselves and their parishioners, and which, quote, social gospel, unquote, becomes in fact indistinguishable from advocacy of the welfare state by socialist politicians. And some actually use their pulpits to preach outright communism, often in very thin disguise, if any, while having the hypocrisy as atheists to thank God in public for their progressive apostasy. It may shock the Protestants among you to have all of these things said out loud, but you know in your hearts that they are true. It is also true that while later, perhaps slower, and not yet so far advanced in some of these cases, the same trend of worldly disillusionment and loss of true faith is visible among Catholics, among Jews, among Muslims, among Buddhists, and among the formerly devout believers of every great religion of the world. We must not only know the truth, but face the truth, if it is to set us free or to keep us so. And the fundamental truth of our times, gentlemen, as distinguished from the fundamentalist truth, is just this. Except for the diminishing number of fundamentalists of all religions and the increasing but still comparatively small percentage of the human race which has fervently accepted communism as a religion, all faith has been replaced or is rapidly being replaced by a pragmatic opportunism with hedonistic aims. And what a fall that is for a race which can boast of once having listened to a St. Augustine, a St. Francis of Assisi, a John Milton, or an Alfred Tennyson. The further and more specific manifestation of that fundamental truth is that in Western Europe and America today we are living in a spiritual vacuum, exactly as were the Romans after they had lost any real faith in their pagan gods and before the rise of Christianity. In the middle of the 19th century, Lord Tennyson, with one of the greatest and most rational minds, at the very apex of the Enlightenment achieved by the Western European civilization, could still write with complete conviction, "Our little systems have their day. They have their day and cease to be. They are but broken lights of thee, and thou, O Lord, art more than they." Compare that with the acutely cynical flippancy of a current gem, which goes something as follows. A life force afflicted with doubt as to what its own being was about said, "The truth I can't find, but I'm creating a mind which may be able to figure it out." And in that comparison you can see the magnitude of our loss as to a base for our morals, our purposes, and our aspirations. For the next part of the truth we must face is that for the past several hundred years our morality in Europe and America was tied to a belief in the rewards and punishments delineated by Christian dogma, to the accepted commandments of a very real and very majestic deity, and to the desire of the true believer to become worthy of the love of an omniscient living God. The reality and earnestness of Christian faith was the foundation of our ethics and the substance of our consciences. When Voltaire said that if God did not exist, we should have to invent him, it was a very blasphemous remark, but a very penetrating one, as to the dependence at that time of morals, humanitarianism, and purposes on what has since come to be called the anthropomorphic conception, that is, a God in whose image man himself was created. Now the trouble is that, in the minds of a vast majority of worshippers, their God had become too close, too concretely defined, and all the details of heaven and hell and of their God's creation and rule of the earth itself had become too vividly and too rigidly put in place. This whole framework of belief could not withstand the sheer facts and convincing rationalizations of the scientific revolution. When Herbert Spencer relegated his own divine being to the infinitely remote and impersonal classification of a first cause, those increasing thousands of intelligent human beings who followed his convincing analyses found that the celestial palace they had built in their minds began to look empty, unnecessary, and perhaps ridiculous. And by the time Ernest Haeckel came to write his Riddle of the Universe, that palace and all the foundations of dogma and doctrine which supported it were crumbling into tragic ruins. For our fathers and their religious preceptors had become too specific and too finite in their beliefs about the infinite, too egocentric and almost patronizing in their adoption of a deity as himself somehow created primarily to be a father to man. When I went to Sunday school in a country Baptist church 50 years ago, I was taught, with a huge chart on the wall to reinforce the teaching and emphasize its accuracy, that the world was created in 4004 B.C., and I am sure that chart had been drawn and those Sunday school lessons written by good Christians who devoutly believed their own teachings. A religious faith had somehow come to rest its case in the minds of men on these and similar minute and unjustified projections of its more important certainties. As increasing knowledge of history and science made it more and more impossible for the intelligent mind to accept the projections, the more general and deeper articles of faith began to lose their hold as well. But these deeper articles of faith were, for most men, the straw with which were built the bricks of their consciences. Without this straw, the bricks either did not get built at all or were shoddy and insecure against the erosion of opportunism or the onslaughts of temptation. Through many centuries, Christianity, despite all of its splits and schisms, supplied the fabric of morality for the whole Western world, through its threats of punishments, promises of rewards, and the humanizing effect of its proffered love by and for a divine Father. But despite all the billions of words that have been written to the contrary, that fabric is now pierced and torn and weakened beyond needed dependability. For a vast majority of those who proclaim themselves Christians today and attend church services do not really and literally believe in either the punishments, the rewards, or even in the physical and biological existence of a divine Father with any interest in their personal lives and actions. The momentum of a former belief and the customs which grew out of it still have great value, but the fabric is worn too thin to have its old effectiveness. Now, please do not jump to any conclusions that I want to see Christianity denied, discarded, or even further weakened in the slightest. Exactly the opposite is true, as I hope to make clear when we come back to this subject from the constructive side tomorrow. But I am not in favor of trying to reimpose all or any of the strands of a fundamentalist faith on those whose reason, whether right or wrong, has honestly told them that we cannot know such positive things about the unknowable. For that would be like trying to tie the waves of the ocean together with ropes, or to confine them with fishing nets. But I believe there is a broader and more encompassing faith to which we can all subscribe, without any of us doing the slightest violation to the more specific doctrines of his own creed or altars of his own devotion. And I believe it is an ennobling conception, equally acceptable to the most fundamentalist Christian or the most rationalistic idealist, because its whole purport is to strengthen and synthesize the ennobling characteristics of each man and the ennobling impulses of his own personal religion. It is a conception which the Baptist John Birch, the Catholic Hilaire Belloc, and the agnostic Thomas Jefferson would alike have welcomed. and in the short time we can give to so mighty a subject in this particular program, I shall return to it tomorrow to the extent necessary for its place in my immediate proposals. What I am trying to do now is merely to make a realistic appraisal of our weaknesses, because without doing so we can only dissipate our remaining strength in trying to build fortifications and temples on sinking mud or shifting sand. For not only is this loss of reinforcing faith in the cement of our morals a weakness in itself of immense significance, but like all of our weaknesses, it has been pounced upon by the communists and used and made worse by them with great skill and determination for their own purposes. When an individual American or any other human being sees himself as no longer responsible to a divine being, but as merely a living accident, not connected in any way with cosmological purpose, it becomes far easier for him to make his decisions about his own life and actions entirely on the basis of his temporal comforts and the earthly desires of his own personality. If he is the kind of man that wants financial success for the ease or leisure and travel or the prestige which it supposedly brings, and sometimes does, he is not going to buck communist pressures in any way that will endanger that success or handicap his progress. If he is imbued with ambition for power, he is more readily inclined to get on the communist bandwagon, if that seems to be the surest road to power, as it certainly does to a great many Americans today. The communists are able to use this lack of moral stamina among their enemies in 1,000 ways to make their own progress easier and the conquest of those enemies more rapid. The most terrible result of this collapse of the rock of faith on which our morality was built is the rise of the amoral man, of which the usual communist himself is the most illustrative example. For an amoral man like Stalin is infinitely worse from the point of view of a humanitarian civilization than an immoral one like Hitler. An immoral man may lie, steal, and murder, the worst of them even without any seeming limit or hesitation. But it hurts his conscience. He is, at least potentially, susceptible to humanitarian or moral considerations to some extent, and if they are presented cogently enough to him. There is even the possibility always that he may sometime, or in some ways, repent and make what amends he can for his crimes. An amoral man, however, has simply wiped out his conscience, along with any reason for its existence. He is not immoral, even when performing cold-blooded mass murders, because to him there is no such thing as either morality or immorality. There is only the pragmatic consideration of the advantages or disadvantages to himself for his own personal desires or plans in any action, whether it be the building of a monument or the murder of his wife. And these amoral men, the products of a materialistic and sophomoric disillusionment, who have not yet gone on in their thinking to deeper and more permanent truths, now stalk in our midst in greater numbers than ever before in history. Such men among the communists, and they are plentiful and highly placed, have no real dedication even to communism. They regard it merely as an expedient means to satisfy their personal ambitions more nearly than would any other star to which they might hitch their wagons. But on our own side of the fence, among the millions who either are or pretend to be non-communists, the amoral man, who has no slightest inner concern with right or wrong, is one of the greatest causes of our constant retreat and one of the greatest dangers to our survival. And he doesn't wear any label. He usually lives up to the appearance of excellent morals because it is expedient for his purposes, and you will usually find him in church on Sunday morning, maybe even a Catholic church. But as a member of the United States Senate, running for the presidency, and smart enough to know the strong communist support behind the scenes which he will have to get in order to have any chance of being nominated in 1960, such an amoral man can do a tremendous amount of ball carrying on behalf of the communist aims here in the United States, and he can do an almost equal amount of damage to anti-communist morale in other parts of the world by his well-publicized speeches against Chiang Kai-shek or in favor of the Algerian rebels. Or an immoral man, as the head of a great so-called republic, may have no slightest scruples or concern about its fate or the fate of other nations in the face of communist conquest and of the cruel tyranny of their rule. And any similarity of characters in this story to any living persons is not coincidental. As to the more normal run of men, whose consciences have been weakened but not abolished by their loss of faith, I tried to cover the various ways many of them are converted into communists or are made to do communist bidding by many different kinds of appeals, pressures, and proselytizing in an article entitled Why People Become Communists. There are reprints of it in the little packets for each of you that I brought with me, and I hope that those who have not already read the article may be willing to do so. For the answers given there, although put together by such an amateur as myself, have been passed on by experts like J.B. Matthews as being authentic. And these reasons why apparently sane and normal Americans join up with the communists give a part of the present picture which it is important for us to keep in mind in connection with all that we plan and do. But we couldn't take time to go into that complex field here, even if I had not already covered it to the best of my ability in the article which is available. For the chief point of this whole present section of our discussion is a more general one. It runs parallel to the main point in connection with the extent to which the cancer of collectivism has weakened and endangered us. It is that as important and absolutely vital as our stopping the communists has become, and as much as our loss of moral fiber is now deliberately made more rapid and more damaging by the communists for their present and future purposes, even throwing the communists completely out of the picture would not stop the fatal deterioration in our sense of values which is now in process. Besides the short-term job of eliminating the communist danger, and Herculean as that job may be, it has to be done in a short term or it can't be done at all, we have the equally important longer-range job of ending this mass psychological flight towards amorality and of restoring convincing reasons for men once again to strive to live up to moral and humanitarian ideals. Otherwise, there is no chance of saving our Christian-style civilization from self-destruction, and it will merely go down to chaos and the ultimate serfdom of the weak under the strong more lingeringly than if it is destroyed and its once free members are enslaved by the communists. But whereas stopping the disease of collectivism is a matter of honest diagnosis and drastic surgery, this equally gigantic problem is one of restoration rather than of removal. We have to find something to live for, gentlemen, that is greater than ourselves, or we surely fall back from the semi-civilized level of existence which man has laboriously achieved into a moral jungle and its inevitably concomitant intellectual darkness. I tried to put the picture of where we are heading in a sonnet to my good friend Alfred Noyes about a year ago, and fortunately a few months before he died, because it summarizes as concisely and as expressively as I know how the outlook I have been trying to define. I am asking your leave to read it at this point. To Alfred Noyes, as after Rome, now once again the drapes of ignorance and bigotry and lust may close upon the scene, insentient dust will bury the forgotten stage, and apes, who know not man, his glory and his dreams, his wish to be more worthy of his God, will stalk the earth and wield the brutal rod and stamp upon each tiny light that gleams. Amid the dull collective monotone of universal serfdom will be lost the memory of song and singer. Prone and helpless soon, upon the rubbish tossed, will die the muse. Let us rejoice to own this one great poet more before the Holocaust. And it is not only the muse of poetry that will die of abuse and neglect, if man's loss of faith in there being anything in the universe worthwhile except his appetites is permitted to continue. But we do not have to let it continue. Before our very eyes lie all the incentives man needs to set him back on the road of striving towards moral perfection, true intellectual greatness, civilized relationships, and eternal hope for a still better and greater future, which seemed to him to be such natural goals 100 years ago. Making those incentives understood and giving contemporary man a renewed faith in himself, in his destiny, and in a still greater God than was recognized and worshipped by his ancestors, is a task for myriads of dedicated individuals over generations of time. We can only contribute all we are able to its proper beginning. But without such a goal and purpose, all of our efforts simply to stop communism or to destroy an ephemeral conspiracy of gangsters are not only doomed to failure, even if successful, they would but postpone the days of darkness for our children, for their children, and for a race of men that once knew the light. We shall return to the constructive side of this need and this undertaking in the morning.